Welcome to the fourth and final session of this important conference, The Power of Public Activism, which is a very important topic. The three speakers are Philip Lymbery, the Global CEO of Compassion in World Farming, who will cover the animal welfare movement's contribution to climate action. Then Nick Mabey, CEO of E3G, who will look at building stakeholders' coalitions in a post-COVID world. And then Alex Clark, who has just introduced himself from the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, and also, incidentally, a European scholar. And he will address the coordination challenges for non-state initiatives. Just another brief word about the three. Philip is also president of the Eurogroup for Animals and an award-winning author. And the good news is that he is starting work on his third major tome on the way we treat animals on the planet, which is entitled 60 Harvests Left. Nick was a senior advisor to the strategy unit at Number 10, subsequently seconded to the FCO, and played a leading role in London Climate Action Week. Alex's CV shows that coordination is at the centre of his work, including in galvanising the groundswell of climate action. They will then be followed by the Q&A session, involving, of course, you, the audience, and you'll know the drill from previous sessions. You type the Qs, and we do our best to provide the As. So, Philip, once you're ready with your presentation, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sir David, and thank you to the organisers for having me along today. I would like to share with you the power of public activism to make sure that we not only drive forward big issues, big challenges facing all of us, but that we focus on all of the components of tackling those challenges. What I'm speaking to here is that within the climate debate, the underrated component, the component that barely makes it on the Conference of the Parties agendas, is food. And so I would like to put it to this audience that we actually need to rethink food as if climate matters. And I'm going to not only look at the problems, but focus on how the solutions are already with us or emerging aplenty, how regenerative and what I would call modern food will save our bacon. So to begin, let's talk about the big one. We've got to balance mitigating climate change with feeding a hungry world, feeding a growing world population. We've got a world population now of 7.8 billion people, and they are accompanied every year by an 80 billion animal livestock sector. 2/3 of those animals are raised on factory farms. They're caged, crammed and confined and fed on grain, cereals and soya and the like. What have they got to do with climate change? Well, the livestock sector already produces 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's a UN figure. And of course, the livestock sector is growing. So that proportion in terms of real emissions is a growing sector. That 14.5, to put it into perspective, is more greenhouse gases than the direct emissions from all the world's planes, trains and cars put together. In terms of land, the livestock sector is huge. Agriculture in total occupies half the world's habitable land. Of that, 83% is dedicated to animal production. What do we get back from that? Well, humanity, for 83% of our agricultural land devoted to livestock production, we reap 37% of our protein, and 18% of our calories. We're being shortchanged. That's the simple analysis. So when we look at feeding the world, we have to remember that we have a world of plenty, but still more than 800 million people go to bed hungry every night. And that is in a world that produces enough food. And I've run the numbers using the UN Food and Agriculture Organization database. And I've found that we produce enough for 17.5 billion people on the planet. That's not to say that 17.5 billion people all at once would be a good thing. It would not. It would be an environmental disaster. It's to show that actually feeding the world would be easy if we focused on feeding people nourishing food rather than feeding industrial agriculture. Factory farming, the 2/3 of that livestock sector that keeps animals caged, crammed and confined, feeds those animals with human edible food grown on precious cropland. And the conversion rate is eye-poppingly inefficient. In producing that meat, milk and eggs from factory farms, up to 94% of the food value is wasted in terms of calories and protein. Nearly 2/3 of EU cereals are used as animal feed. Globally, factory farming consumes enough feed crops to feed 4 billion people. So we have to ask ourselves, are we feeding the world or feeding the world's factory farms? And as we do that, as we feed those factory farms, we're not only squandering huge amounts of food, adding to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, we're also busting other planetary boundaries, as this schematic shows. It shows, for example, that we've already busted planetary boundaries for nitrogen pollution. The big emitter of nitrogen is industrial agriculture, using artificial fertilizers to produce monocultures of grain and so on. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is to stop doing the bad stuff, to stop doing factory farming. It doesn't produce food, it wastes food. And it does so in a particularly damaging way. A better way is to be nature friendly, to farm as if tomorrow matters, to be regenerative. And what does regenerative farming bring before we look at what it is? Regenerative farming moves away from monocultures, single crops, or single animal species. It restores animals to the land where their welfare has much greater scope. It reduces chemical pesticide, artificial fertilizer, and antibiotic use. Remember that 73% of the world's antibiotics are fed to farmed animals, largely to mitigate the effects of factory farming. It reduces pollution, conserves water, restores wildlife and biodiversity, regenerates soil fertility, and stores carbon from the atmosphere. Worth remembering that the soil already is estimated to hold twice as much carbon as the entire atmosphere. And if we treated it right, it could sequester 10 to 20% of all the greenhouse gas emissions currently being emitted by humanity if we regeneratively farmed half of our cropland. That's a big deal. What does it look like? It looks like restoring animals to their ecological niche as rotating grazing animals. Here is one example. It's actually in Basingstoke, so not a million miles away from Oxford. It's run by a farmer called Tim May, who was a factory farmer. His farm was wall-to-wall monoculture crops. He used to spend £700 an acre in chemical fertilizers and pesticides, but he realized his yields were declining because his soils were getting tired. So what did he do? He restored animals to that ecological niche. And now his cattle are followed by sheep, are followed by pigs, are followed by chickens in a wonderful assemblage in a farm that is not a smallholder farm by any means. It is 10 times bigger than the UK average. In recent times, we've seen the rise of veganism. We've seen adverts like this in KFC. Who would have thought it only 2 or 3 years ago? 11 herbs and spices, 0 chicken from KFC. Greggs have got in on the act, even small chippies. Essentially, everyone wants to show their vegan credentials. But there's a paradox here, that whilst there are now more vegetarians and vegans in Britain and the West, there is actually more meat being eaten per capita than ever before. The overall picture when it comes to eating meat is that plant-based alternatives are going through an explosive growth, but it's coming from a low base. That red meat, beef, lamb, and so forth, is down, marginally down. Chicken and fish are up quite significantly. So we're trading out of red meat animals into white meat animals. What's the outlook? Well, according to commentators, the outlook is not good. Overall meat consumption is thought to almost double by the middle of the century. And that's going to take with it greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, land, and so on. So on current business as usual projections, our food alone could trigger catastrophic climate change, undoing the wonderful work being done in other sectors. To reverse this, one of the things we need to do is cut meat consumption by half or more, which is why meat and food more generally needs to be on the agenda at COP26. Now, we've talked about beef, people trading out of beef into chicken. We should remember that not all beef is the same. This is a US beef feedlot. It looks very different to pasture-raised beef cattle, which is, of course, how a lot of cattle are reared in Britain. And there's simply no benefit from trading out of beef raised on a pasture and switching to this industrial chicken or fish. All you do is swap one set of problems for another set of problems. But there's a new meat in town. This is the great news. There's not only a better way of farming, regenerative agriculture, restoring animals to the land and so on, but there's a new meat in town, cultured meat, which is produced from stem cells in bioreactors. And this meat, according to a benchmark study, this production method can be up to 95% lower in greenhouse gases and use a tiny fraction of the amount of land whilst producing huge quantities of food. The first public sale, this is now reality, happened on the 19th of December in Singapore. Supermarket availability, widespread, is still a little way out, 5 to 10 years, but it could take hold very quickly. It's one of the modern foods. And there's another modern food, which is fermentation. It's essentially what happens in a cow, only not in a cow. Think bread and wine here for a moment. Microbes in stainless steel vessels. Bacteria, fungi, algae, add the ingredients and off you go. No animals involved. The great thing about fermentation is that it's evolving, and there is now precision fermentation, where essentially one can program microbes to produce just about any protein, any molecule that you're looking for. And the efficiencies of this new emerging technique promise to be tremendous. 100 times more land efficient, 25 times more efficient at feed conversion, 10 times more water efficient, and an ability to produce individual nutrients at a fraction of the cost is where the technology is looking to get to. And it even offers the opportunity to take DNA samples and produce proteins from extinct plants or animals. If you can get the DNA that you can program into the system, then the theory at least is you can produce proteins from those animals. So the question is, anyone fancy a woolly mammoth burger in the near future? Another innovation, thin air proteins, I call it. NASA came up with this original concept in the 1960s. Let's make protein from thin air. After all, there's nothing else but exhalation in space when you've got a spacesuit on. And this is about making meat from the air, like making yogurt. Carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, combined with water and minerals in a probiotic production process. So long as you get the energy inputs right, it can produce you green and planet-friendly outputs with amino acid content identical to meat. So protein's future is looking rosy. Factory farmed products, as we see them at the moment, is the bad guy. It's the cheap anonymous one that is there because of favorable economics, subsidies, loss leads, unaccounted externalities. Frankly, no one accounts for those environmental harms. The business model is based on high volumes and slim margins, which means that it's super vulnerable to a lower priced competitor, especially now that its scale is reaching its limitation. It's also not future fit, being vulnerable to disease and climate shocks. Factory farming's undoing, therefore, could well be the one thing which has kept it supreme for decades, and that is economics, because competition from modern foods could strip its market away, predicted to be 10 times cheaper by 2035. So, in conclusion then, Chairman, using a quote from Lampedusa, for everything to stay the same, everything in the food system at least must change. EU policy and subsidy measures therefore are urgently needed to move away from industrial agriculture, to reduce live animal products, to enable nature-friendly farming, and to enable this modern foods revolution that essentially will buy us time to save the planet from overheating and open the door to a better future. Chairman, I put it to you that to rethink food is something we absolutely need to do if we are to go forward as if climate matters. Thank you.
Philip, thank you very much for a very powerful presentation. Right, Nick, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And it's, hope my video's on there. Yeah, excellent. Hi, I'm Nick Mabey, and I'm very glad, as usual with these things, you always wonder what the previous speaker's going to say, as we're not coordinated, but actually this is it's a very good lead into my discussion, which is really going to be about what is the role of the public or stakeholders in climate action. And I want to make kind of 3 points, which really the food issue is a classic illustrator of. The first one is public involvement is going from a nice to have to a must have as we go to really deep structural change in decarbonisation. The second point is that we need to change not just what policies we do, but how we make policy if we're going to be serious about how the public are going to be involved. And lastly, it's really don't outsource the activism. Everybody, in order to make a net zero resilient society, needs to be involved in any different ways. This is not just about kind of NGOs on the street or XR protesting. It's about a whole society change, which requires all different parts of society to move together. So kind of moving on that first point, why does public involvement move from a kind of nice to have consultation, stakeholder engagement type discussion to a must have? Well, the first one is we need public permission to do the kind of rapid change we need to meet the really ambitious goals of going net zero kind of before mid-century. And that's why, because basically the public is going to be affected. Up until now, really, we've been changing things behind the plug. You know, changing how we generate electricity doesn't change the electricity you use. But when you're going to change people's heating systems, when you're going to change how they drive and what they drive, how they move, what they eat, what industries they work in, you need permission. It needs to be visible, and so the public need to debate it. So at the first level, as a citizen, We need the public to be involved in this process because they need to give permission. But we also, at a more fundamental level, need social and cultural change if we're going to have a safe transition. One of the perhaps little dirty secrets of the climate transition is that there are two trajectories in all the models which the targets you see are based on. One involves a huge amount of techno fixes which bury carbon under the ground in various different ways, but allow us to carry on eating lots of meat and go a bit slower in terms of our use of different alternatives to aviation. The other one requires people to change what they do and consume in different ways, but actually gets us to zero without having to rely on large-scale, unproven technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. But we're not going to have that change in behavior unless we have a discussion. Until COVID, policymakers basically thought behavior change at large scale was ridiculous. They talked about nudging, they talked about minor marginal shifts. But the massive changes we've seen around COVID in lifestyles, in work patterns, has opened their eyes to the fact that actually, if there's a big enough reason, you can ask the public to do really big things. And so part of the discussion is, as we come out of COVID, how much of the cultural changes we've seen will remain and can be built on and incentivized? And how will policymakers look at the idea of building societal consensus for large shifts in, for example, how and what we eat? And how should that come about? The third reason why kind of bringing the broader public into this debate is needed is because we need a national and a global social contract for the climate to get to a safe climate. If you look at who's engaged in the climate debate, you'll see it's dominated by those who produce the problem. It's all the dirty industries. In most countries, and we work globally, the people who are impacted by climate change are hardly ever in the discussion, whether you're a fisherman, so if you, and they're also hardly ever compensated. So in this country, if you're a coal miner or a steel worker, there will be a plan for your just transition to a zero carbon future. If you're a fisherman who owns quota, which then is made worthless because the fish swim north because the sea gets warmer, like all the cod quota we have in the North Sea, you don't get any compensation. And that's a treasury position. No compensation for people impacted by climate change, lots of compensation for people impacted by climate policy. That is not a stable social contract, and that's the same in every country we work in. So how do we decide who is protected and who pays? Why is it that large companies get government protection from flood, but lots of people in individual households don't? Why do I subsidize rich people who live on floodplains?
Nick, this may be just me, but you seem to me to have frozen.
Frozen, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
frozen.
Okay, so you've been frozen for about 10 seconds. So could you find a way of moving back a little?
You may have to move on. Okay, good.
Okay,
He's
there's
back.
Nick. He's moving.
Okay, have I got back again?
You have,
Yes.
congratulations. Brilliant.
Can you go
You
back
must
by
tell me how
10
to do
seconds?
it.
Involves switching Wi-Fi providers. Yeah, so basically, if you're looking at Caribbean countries who have seen 40% of their infrastructure damaged swept away by increased hurricanes over the last few years with no insurance, which they could access, there's going to be an issue of how do we help those countries who are damaged by climate action, which we've not been doing fast enough? What is that international social contract? And the public, that's going to mean higher aid bills, which as we see at the moment is extremely controversial. So again, that's the last one. And then the last one is we need to see activism through work and professions, not just through our role as citizens or consumers. We're also workers. We're not just citizens. We're not just consumers. We're also workers. What's the role of you in your job in moving to a climate safe world? What's your contribution as a professional, as an academic, as elsewhere? What should you be saying to your employer? What should you be saying? And we're seeing this everywhere. XR, I think, was an amazing movement. Not so much for did on the streets of London, that was quite good, but it was quite traditional activism, but because it really promulgated a huge set of movements in architects declares, engineers declare, accountants declares, which started to have discussions inside professions about what were the ethics of an architect building a fossil fuel using house? And so a lot of areas, they started to bring in all these people saying, every day in my job, I can determine the forward shape of society and what should be my responsibility as a professional individual or worker for that. It wasn't the first time it's happened, but I think it's very powerful that we have agency as employees and workers and professionals, not just as citizens or consumers. So that's it. So again, to move as fast as we need to move, we need to have multiple different drivers of change and multiple different areas to move forward and to get permission to do it. And that's different to just some kind of consultation process. So we need to redesign, second point, how we do policy, how we engage with people, what we do. And most climate policy at the moment is made in models. People run relatively unsophisticated economic models that tell them things are cheaper or more expensive to do things. And that often goes reasonably linearly into policy. And it was very frustrating when I was working in government on this to see how people believed these abstract models when they were just deeply simplistic representations. But the models tell us some things about what to do. They don't tell us how to shift things. They don't tell us what the benefits are. So they don't tell us how electric cars won't just make their air cleaner, it will also make streets quieter, which will benefit particularly poor communities who are always in the noisiest parts of cities, and actually will increase the value of their property. It won't tell us about the health benefits of moving to a meat-free diet or a low-meat diet. It won't tell us about the benefits of redesigning cities so they're more resilient and easier to travel in and more healthy, the benefits to mental and physical health. So it won't tell us how moving to a clean energy system will help those poorest families who suffer most from volatility and income and volatility in bills have more stable income and keep jobs in the community. So thinking about those broad, starting from people rather than tons of carbon, and saying, how can this transition best benefit people? In the jargon of this government, how can it level up areas? How can it benefit and include and be multiple benefits? So if we're going to change things, we might as well change multiple things at once. That's not thinking with models, that's thinking about society and how society works. And to do that, you need to involve citizens in the decisions. Because again, the one thing, particularly in the UK, but UK is very centralized as a country, much more so than France, for example. But making decisions over what's built and what future you have is so important. And so many big decisions on infrastructure. And if you poll people in all countries, they say they want more agency over infrastructure. I mean, look at the debate on HS2. As critical, and climate change requires a total shift of infrastructure from big centralized projects to small distributed projects, from big flood defenses to lots of small natural resilience solutions, from big power stations to insulating people's houses. But at the moment, the decision-making systems we have are very centralized. They're very biased towards large actors and big projects. And so if we want the future we need, we're going to have to change the way we make decisions about that and who makes decisions about that. So actually at the heart, as well as think about all these different benefits, we need to think about who decides, where they decide, and particularly fundamentally to the climate, climate happens in places. And we're going to need to move from abstract national systems to place-based systems and place-based democracy and governance. So again, the second bit about people is we need to bring people into those decision-making systems if we actually want to get the future we want. And then finally, again, don't outsource the activism. Don't think this is something other people activate on climate and I don't because I just have a normal job. We won as E3G London Climate Action Week. We started in 2019. And one of the main aims of that was to get out of the climate bubble and work with people in all parts of society to really show what a whole of society approach to climate looked like. If we took climate seriously, how would people act? So, for example, we've been working on a huge impact from the cultural institutions, from Tate to BM to small arts organizations, who use their artistic spaces to engage people on what does it mean to understand climate change as an issue or as a societal problem in myriad, amazing, interesting ways. And then that's now spilled over to the fashion industry, to the food industry. So people experience and engaging not just on their own emissions, and they do, there's a whole sustainable film. If you look at the end of a film, you'll see Albert sign that's about low carbon film production. It's something that BAFTA produced in the UK. A whole set of creative industries working around explaining and engaging on climate change and doing stuff. There's other areas we brought in professionals. So we've also convened through London Climate Action Week a whole set of professionals, from architects to accountants to engineers, about what can they do to align with climate change. And there's lots going on. They're all different approaches. Can we bring that together and have a kind of charter for what it means to align your profession with climate change? What's your professional responsibility? What should they be telling universities? You know, why should universities teach anybody about internal combustion engines anymore? What can you become it's not important to be an engineer. There won't be an internal combustion engine for engineers graduating in this crop of engineers because we're banning ICEs. So again, how can we bring that? If you think of health and doctors, it's 12% of the economy. It picks up the damage from climate change, but it has virtually no voice in the debate. How can we organize those issues? So one of the areas we're using at London Climate Action Week, we're bringing together a huge number of education providers at tertiary, primary and secondary in a school summit, an education summit on climate, to talk about the role of the education sector as teachers, as infrastructure, as community engagements. So those are the kind of pieces. We see COP26 as an opportunity, particularly in the UK, to kind of replicate what we've been trying in London across the country, but also showcasing to the world what the social, cultural and political change we need to deliver to produce the economic and technical change people talk about, the wonderful presentation on farming, what that looks like. What does a whole of society approach to climate change look like in lived? Because the UK, I think, is a really interesting place to do it. And that's why my kind of final word in climate change, tackling climate change is a remorselessly audacious project. I mean, changing the whole of the world's economic infrastructure, food, transport systems in 3 decades simultaneously globally. It's the more you talk about, the more ridiculous it seems. So you're not going to do it for a technocratic approach. You're only going to do it through something that mobilizes the whole of society and brings people together and actually has a new debate on what we need to do. And for me, that is one of the most exciting parts of where we're at in the COP26 front, because we're moving from a policy wonks agenda to a truly societal agenda. Thank you.
Nick, thank you very much. And as you said, it sort of gelled very well with the opening remarks by Philip. And what you said about the effects of COVID were also very interesting. Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I was expecting to say something Monty Python-esque now for something completely different, but actually it segues quite nicely from what Nick's just said. And I think I'll just sort of kick off to quoting the late David McKay saying, if everyone does a little, we'll achieve only a little. I think that's truer than ever now. So what I'll do over the next 10 minutes or so is describe in some detail what the coordination challenge looks like for initiatives beyond national governments, because they're so clearly need to be part of the solution in multifaceted ways, and then touch on a potential leverage point connected to national governments that isn't discussed too much. So as we've seen in earlier discussions today, ranging from public support for carbon pricing to diet, the involvement of civil society and private enterprise and subnational government in climate policies is essential. It's also nothing new, and the diversity in the number of actors with a stake in decisions made at COPs, both at COP in the past and at COP26 this year and further into the future, has long been quite substantial and is rising. But as Nick suggested, those with most to lose tend to have the least protection, whether it's in the context of international negotiations and agreements or national decarbonisation and adaptation policies. And as the kind of array of interests that's represented becomes more muddled and more complex, there's an increasing need for smart coordination among actors with similar priorities to direct momentum towards ambitious and just policies that are built to last in the way that they're politically resilient. So back in 2016 in Morocco at COP26, the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action was established, along with 2 rotating climate action champion roles, which were held by the country presidencies of the previous and the upcoming COPs, to institutionalize to a degree the linkage process between the sort of nation state driven world of climate negotiations through the UNFCCC and the signatories of the Paris Agreement on the one hand, and this sort of array of non-state actors on the other. Interestingly, the extension of this mandate was passed essentially unopposed at COP25 in Madrid, where not much else was passed, and made it into the final text with little resistance, which actually provided quite a welcome boost to the active inclusion of non-state subnational actors in the process. So what does this actually involve? So among non-profits, this involves sort of streamlining messaging and reports and communications, and acts as bridges between the often obscure and bureaucratic world of the political and financial apparatus of international climate policy, like the UNFCCC and the Green Climate Fund and so on, and the real world. And there's a sort of a delicate process balancing the need to project clear and consistent messages without losing important subtleties or suppressing minority views or voices. And that's not necessarily going particularly well. And the challenge that the non-profit research community in particular, which is large and growing when it comes to climate, is that most of the largest and most powerful convening actors and thought leaders are Euro or US centric, and building linkages between indigenous communities and developing world towns and cities on the one hand, and climate lobbyists and negotiators with real influence on the other, is an undertaking that requires pretty sustained effort and is not going to happen overnight. Kind of another block is corporations and financial institutions and asset owner groups, which are initiatives like Climate Action 100+, which brings together some of the world's largest asset owners, is gaining traction, but it requires coordinated and sustained lobbying of governments for the implementation of policy that will make such efforts sustainable in the long run, and coordination with the world of development finance to increase investment in much needed green infrastructure and to provide the de-risking necessary for new financial instruments able to address some of these challenges to get off the ground. And earlier today, the EU green taxonomy was mentioned, which helps to identify green assets versus non-green assets, but there's a very long way to go in creating a financial system that can adequately recognize the value of sustainability. And the taxonomy helps, but it doesn't require a link to the real economy that financial decisions will need to have if they are to create real change. And the status quo for now is still really that financial actors are able to essentially wash their hands of deciding what impact is, and just find ways of buying labeled goods in a way that allow them to claim that they have green portfolios, which is why we've had $100 trillion in assets that are supposedly classified as sustainable under the principles of responsible investment, but find that it hasn't made an awful lot of difference, or at least we're still headed very much in the wrong direction. And it's not to say that every institution does this, but we need a more rigorous approach to assessing real economy on the ground impact that I think, as Isabel suggested earlier, isn't necessarily tied to labels that will fast become obsolete. So turning to the kind of the third block of subnational and local governments, things are more complex still. And depending on the country's political system, subnational governments can be very powerful, operating in federalized systems like the US and Germany, or they can be charged with implementing, sometimes or often controversial and highly technical and complicated policies without necessarily the resources or expertise to do so, as we've seen in some parts of Southern Europe and actually in most of the countries that submitted NDCs to the Paris Agreement. And in states where governments are very active in the economy, like China, it's a bit of both, where provincial or local governments don't always have the tools to implement ambitious green policies, but they're also powerful actors in their own right with some degree of influence over those policies, and in fact able to slow them down because of the various interest groups involved. So bringing these disparate groups together is a huge challenge, bearing in mind that they are typically serving completely different objectives, from private profit to social welfare for different subgroups. And the separation of actors into the sort of the three groups that I've outlined is actually an artifact of the UNFCCC's observer structure. And increasingly, we're seeing a regional and sectoral focus on economic transformation instead, partly because regionalizing helps to break down massive political bargaining problems that are a feature of international climate discussions, and partly because a sectoral focus can be a helpful way of aligning disparate actors towards a common goal, as we saw in the presentation earlier, or at least developing a common language for discussion and avoiding this this frequent descent into a morass of irreconcilable positions. And the UK's work, including through the Energy Transitions Commission, is fairly aligned with this framing. And of course, we could debate all day over whether this sort of economistic sectoral focus signals that neoliberalism has won. But if we accept that the only feasible way of getting to net zero is making use of these economic levers, I think it's fair to say that no better idea has really come to the fore for organising such varied interests in time, at least. Now, Oxford is quite active in this area, as Tom Hale referenced earlier today. Galvanising the groundswell of climate actions is a loose network which is coordinated by the Blavatnik School here, aiming to support this process of integrating non-state actors into the conversation and channeling demands in a sort of coherent and productive fashion. There's too much to cover in detail, but I'll just highlight a couple of key priorities ahead of Glasgow in the autumn. One is supporting the climate action champions Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Munoz in their efforts to reflect on what's worked with the Marrakesh Partnership this far and build a vision for its future out to the mid-2020s and beyond. And second is an intensifying focus on engaging with African non-state actors, both in general to plug a very clear gap, most obviously around adaptation and resilience, and in preparation for COP27, which is expected to be hosted in Africa, although it's all up in the air at the moment. And finally is keeping a close eye on data collection, aggregation and quality control, both in the finance sector and elsewhere, at the subnational level in particular. And quite excitingly at the moment, opportunities are opening up for geospatial technologies coupled with advanced machine learning capabilities, including at Oxford, to start to itemize and identify physical assets at a granular level, which may play a role not just in helping understand who needs protecting and from what, but in shaping and driving non-state action and monitoring progress by these different actors. So just before finishing, I want to turn briefly to a less studied but nonetheless very important grey area lying between states and non-state actors, which is state-owned enterprises. And if we're thinking about climate action from a sectoral perspective, understanding the role of these enterprises, known as SOEs, is critical. And there are conservative estimates coming out of Columbia University that put the annual emissions directly attributable to SOEs well over 6 gigatons annually, which is more than every other country except the US and China. And depending on the country and circumstances, SOEs can exist on a continuum ranging from being essentially direct agents of the government to agents in their own right with significant influence over the government. And state-owned assets can include national oil companies, power generators, heavy industry, aviation, shipping, ports, public transport, buildings, military, and so on. Now, in Western Europe, their state-owned enterprises do still exist, but they're usually also listed companies with transparency and competing with the private sector. But elsewhere in Eastern Europe and indeed most of the rest of the world, SOEs are largely opaque. They're not listed. You can't just go and look up information on them as you can with ExxonMobil, for example. And on top of that, because they're backed by government, they don't play by the same rules as private firms. And they usually enjoy greater access to finance and better terms as well. But they also have objectives other than profit maximization, such as employment, security of energy supply, and so on. So understanding their role in this transition is a huge challenge. They're also not really present at gatherings such as COP26. There aren't actually that many large SOEs, but the metrics of success can be different for each one, and it's hard to compare them from an analytical standpoint. But governments can use their enterprises that they're shareholders in to express their policy preferences, to lead by example, and to really help tip sectors that are currently on the verge of a transition to a new technology or a new configuration in the right direction. I think I'm over time, so I won't go into any more detail other than to say that I'm working with a couple of people at Columbia to try and understand what these levers are for governments using their state-owned enterprises to help achieve climate policy goals and get around sometimes the need to institute carbon pricing across the whole economy, for example. And it varies from country to country, but this is clearly a very significant opportunity that really does need more attention, and it definitely needs more data. So from an academic point of view, it's a very difficult problem, but I'm firmly convinced that the SOEs are potentially very powerful drivers of non-state climate action if their strengths are used properly, and they deserve much more attention. So I think I'll stop there. Sorry if I spoke rather fast, but I had a lot to get through, and looking forward to the next few minutes. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. Some very interesting common themes and threads running through the three presentations. So congratulations to Adrian on putting it and finding the three speakers and it gelling so well together. We've got a question from Daniel Hardy of UPEP on the following lines. Traditional agricultural areas are often politically overrepresented and exercise an effective veto. Are there estimates of how much it will cost to pay them off? And now, on the surface, this is probably a question for Philip, but since it raises the question of entrenched interests, I'm quite sure that Nick and Alex would also like to have their say on this. But if we start with you, Philip.
Yeah, I was pondering this question, and the overall value of the meat industry globally is getting on for $1,000 billion. Could we pay them off? Is that could we pay off particular regions, regions that are particularly majoring on industrial agriculture are, of course, the US, the EU, and other, and increasingly China. My thought on this is probably it's best, rather than paying them off, to stop paying the industrial agriculturalists. It's worth remembering that 40% of the entire EU budget goes towards agricultural subsidies, which have the overall effect of increasing industrialization. So the first thing we can do is redirect the subsidies, as post-Brexit Britain is looking to do, away from subsidizing industrial agriculture and instead redirecting subsidies to a framework that in the UK is called public money for public goods being more nature friendly or welfare friendly, farming, and a range of other things. The other way that I think we can tackle this is actually through fiscal penalties by taxing meat from factory farms, and use that money to make good food, whether that be meat from regenerative or fruit and vegetables, to make those products cheaper and more widely available, so that actually we make decent food a public right rather than a privilege. And the third thing that I think is coming on stream and is very viable is to replace. So rather than paying off the bad aspects of the meat industry around the world, let's replace it. And the areas that are most ripe for replacement with things like cultured meat are those industrial sectors of the meat industry, particularly those centered in North America and the EU.
Right, thank you very much, Philip. Nick, Alex, would you have anything to add on the broader question of how you confront entrenched interests?
And I think this is, as said, not all jobs are equal politically. So the government changed the policy on solar in the UK and got rid of 12,000 jobs in 1 year, which is more jobs than are in the fishing industry, even if you count processing. So, but you didn't hear anything about that in Parliament, whereas you hear a lot about fishing. Fishermen have the highest political leverage per unit job that I've ever seen in my government career. Agriculture comes a close second, but the question is which agriculture? So it's also about which bit of an industry has muscle in lobbying, and it's often not the smaller, more marginalized industry. It's the large, well-funded industry. So, I mean, we usually spend a lot of time unraveling these knotty political problems. The best way to disrupt an industry is demand, especially if it's got state subsidies. So shifting demand really opens up space. But I also think that the key issue for the farming industry is the impact of climate change as well, which actually is pushing a drive towards factory farming in some places. This is not the only, let's put it under under a greenhouse, say the Dutch, and we'll do it all very intensively, and then the rest will go for nature. So for me, what this leads to in most countries and what we're seeing is we need to have an honest discussion about what we want to use land for. Because we're meant to, in this country, we're meant to be increasing forest cover, but people don't want forests on the sheep-nuded hills because they like walking them. But we've never had a proper discussion about land in this country. We blame the common agricultural policy for not having a policy in the UK, but every other bit of Europe manages to have a policy on land, including Scotland. So I think, you know, every industry is different, but I think this agriculture in particular is one of these good examples of there is not a climate discussion here. There is a land, climate, and future and food and health discussion here. It's much bigger. If you try and constrain it in a climate sense, you come up with rather silly solutions that cost a lot. Make the problem bigger, you've got a chance of solving it in a way that is actually pro-benefit for everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Not too much to add other than to say, you know, finding other valuable uses for land is something that's quite feasible. And particularly, you know, if you see a massive disruption to a meat industry that's already very weakly profitable, and once you take out the subsidies, it's not profitable. You know, whether it's meat itself, whether it's things like milk. UK farmers, French farmers haven't been making money for many years now. But you know, there's measuring and articulating the value of the land and the services that it provides. You know, whether it's rivers or whether it's biodiversity and so on, is a really important part of this. The question referred to traditional agricultural areas, but the places that I'm really worried about are really the non-traditional agricultural areas in the largest carbon sinks in the world, talking about Brazil and Indonesia. Actually, you know, if you want to slow deforestation in those areas, the only way to do it is to work with the big players. And it's the small players that, you know, need to make a living, whether it's from palm oil or whether it's through highly inefficient cattle ranching in Brazil in particular. They don't really have an alternative. And there's not the sort of same degree of, you can't sort of ring up, you know, you can negotiate with the sort of 4 largest agro-industry players in Brazil, and you can probably make a fairly big difference in working with them. But, you know, they're part of all of these certification bodies and ESG practices, essentially greenwashing, that no one below a certain scale is going to be able to kind of sit at that table at all. So before even being able to do anything about it, finding a way of bringing those interests, grievances, and imperatives to survive to the table is going to be absolutely the first thing to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question for all 3 of you, which is, from your varying perspectives, how important is COP26? Nick, do you want to have a first go there, and then Alex, and then Philip?
Yeah, I think I'll look at it from several different ways. I mean, the COP26 that's happening this year is different to the COP26 that was going to happen last year. The COP26 that was going to happen last year was going to have to make the political weather against quite a strong headwind, including Donald, who I can now call ex-President Donald Trump. The COP26 this year is going to be kind of receiving and judging the impact of a huge amount of political decisions made to deal with the recovery and what they mean for climate. So it's, you know, so it's going to be a judgment moment as much as a decision moment, because, you know, how we spend the money we're going to put through the recovery and debt relief is going to determine climate action more than virtually any other thing for the next decade. So it's good. So COP is shaping that conversation, and the climate movement, and Alok Sharma, if you listen to him, said there's a golden thread that has to run between the G7, G20 and COP. And by sheer fortuitous coincidence, the 2 hosts of COP, Italy and UK, are also the hosts of the G7 and G20 this year. So that's not a vain hope. That's a group of people sitting in a room with an agenda. So that's the first thing. It kind of provides that a thread through the year for the other big decisions. But I think the second one is, this is the judgment moment of Paris. Is Paris the framework that's going to take us to a safe climate for everybody in the world? Will the public believe that? Will the countries believe that? Will investors believe that? That's the judgment call. Because if it fails, then we'll go into another hiatus where people will walk out and exile, and the people on the streets will not believe it. and we may end up with kind of climate populism, which is not going to achieve anything in my view. But so again, by the time we get to COP, we really need to see a credible move, not a definitive move, but a credible move towards ending fossil fuels and the emissions starting to go down, so that people believe that we are cooperating seriously. Because if we lose the trust of people, and then we'll lose the trust of markets, and then we'll lose the trust of governments, then we've got nothing. So again, so that's why COP26 is so important. It's kind of judgment day for the Paris framework.
Alex. Alex?
Sorry, I always do it once. Failed to unmute. I said I agree with almost all of that, and just to not repeat what's already been said, I'll just answer the question from the perspective of the UK. And obviously now that Brexit has happened, the UK is in a fairly precarious position and needs to find a way of continuing to make itself relevant. And this is a huge opportunity to do that. And it's instructive looking at how the kind of key departments that are engaging on climate issues with other countries are doing this. And the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, is working actively to sort of revolutionize, I suppose, the energy sector decision-making in key economies around the world. And that's obviously China and India and Brazil, and also in EU countries, to kind of get away from exactly the kind of modeling that Nick was discussing earlier, which is, broadly speaking, equilibrium-based economic modeling, not recognizing how quickly things can change. And, surprise, surprise, equilibrium-based modeling tends to favor the status quo, which is something that we just can't afford anymore. And then when it comes to foreign relations, the FCO, which is now the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, has a challenge on its hand at the moment because it's dealing with Hong Kong and also having to deal with the diplomatic relations with China when it comes to climate as well. But it's very clear that the UK expects one of the largest sources of its soft power and of export of its financial and consulting expertise to be climate sustainability and so on, including in Asian markets. So there's a lot riding on COP26 for making a success out of those particular relationships amid all of the other geopolitical upheaval going on. So this is a really critical moment for Britain as well.
Thank you very much, Alex. Philip, how important is COP to you?
I think it's vital. I think that time is running out, and there is not a milestone to be missed. When we aggregate the challenges facing humanity, I would put it that we are facing a climate, nature, and health crisis. All of them are interlinked, as a previous speaker quite rightly highlighted. The scientific assessment is that if you take climate, we've got about a decade left to solve the problem. Not just to talk about it and work out how to solve it, but actually to solve it. Nature, we've lost 3/4 of our nature already, and that's our life support system disappearing before our very eyes. When it comes to health, well, we all know what the current pandemic looks like. So change is needed, and food needs to be central to the discussion at COP26 and at every milestone in mapping a way out of this three-pointed crisis.
Philip, thank you very much. And I think we're pretty much up against our time limit. So in a minute, I will pass over to Charles Enoch, who is going to bring matters to a conclusion. But I'd like to thank the three of you very much for excellent presentations and equally excellent responses to questions from the audience and others. I would like to thank Adrian for all her hard work in assembling this, as well as the other panels. And I would like to thank Julie for all her hard work behind the scenes. You can't see her, but she's there, manipulating the controls. Okay, shall I hand over to you, Adrian, or shall I hand it to Charles?
Charles, absolutely.
Okay, can I just
thank you very much for an excellent panel.
Yeah. Charles.
Hey, thank you very much, David, and thanks for another great session. Yeah, good evening to everybody. and we've already been talking for 5 hours, so I won't keep it very long to conclude here. And we've come to the close of an intensive and highly productive afternoon. And although we didn't know it when it was originally scheduled, as several speakers said at the beginning, the timing is highly appropriate. And yesterday, Joe Biden was inaugurated the US president, ending 4 years of antipathy to international cooperation and action on climate change in his country. And the US is now poised to imminently re-enter the Paris Accord, and we can all move forward towards a quite different COP26 in Glasgow at the end of this year, with much greater prospect of achieving consensus on measures to address climate change. I'd like to first thank all the speakers and the chairs of the 4 panels for 4 superb discussions. The discussion was extremely rich, and I mean, including also the stimulating Qs and the As we had in each of them. I'd also join others in particularly thanking Adrian Chisti of the UPEP project at the European Studies Centre at St Antony's College, Oxford, who was the convener of this excellent programme, as well as the administrators, Julie Adams and Jessica Dancy. I'd like to thank Hartmut Meyer, head of the European Studies Centre at St Antony's and executive chair of the Europeum, as well as Marcin Waleski of the Europeaneum, also at present located at St Antony's, Oxford. And finally, I'd like to thank all the participants, those who stayed with us for the whole 5 hours, and those who've just been there for a few minutes. The conference was held remotely on Zoom. I'd also like to thank the technology providers who've made our meeting feasible. But notwithstanding the miracle of modern technology, we all hope that by the time of COP26, we'll be able to meet physically. And the conference has brought together experts, not just from across Oxford and the rest of the UK, but also from a number of European institutions. And it shows that although the UK is outside the EU for the moment, we're still fully engaged in European and wider international endeavors. The conference began with mega plans, moved down through the macro and finished with the individual. So it started with what we need to achieve and then moved on as to how we'll achieve it. It's of course all interconnected. And so we moved back and forth across a number of these elements. The European Green Plan is an ambitious but realistic framework to address climate change over the coming decades. It should be exemplary for the rest of the world. Indeed, the target of carbon neutrality by 2050 has already generated commitments from China, Japan, Korea, and elsewhere. At COP26, the EU will be a strong force to get agreement to take forward significant action on climate change. So then, if we all accept the science and the need for action, how will it actually be implemented? We've seen pushback against some countries' attempts, as mentioned by several people, the Gilets jaunes in France, as well as resistance from some of those that are significant holders of what will increasingly be stranded assets, such as coal. On this, we heard first on the political process, specifically in the European Parliament. We heard the Parliament is broadly supportive, but it's not yet fully consistent. Greening land use, we also heard later on, will also be important for achieving climate change targets, but the drastic reform of the common agriculture policy that is required was put off by the Parliament for the coming budget round. We then went on to government's role in how fiscal plans can finance the transition, given that budgets will be heavily constrained in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. While it's recognized that raising carbon taxes are a necessary condition for achieving climate change, there seemed as yet to be no consensus on how to levy carbon taxes. Although the panel gave several good ideas, including fiscal federalism, which is quite exciting in a European context. And also the point was made that taxes, although difficult, are more efficient than either regulations or than subsidies, that they generate revenue and lead to a more effective reallocation of decisions. In the third session, we heard about the role of development agencies, central banks, and the private sector. All are already deeply involved in the transition. We heard about the number of projects being financed by the EBRD, as well as development of green bonds. Climate change is also at the core of central banking now, because of central banks' mandate for maintaining financial stability, enhancing disclosure, and managing their own assets. As to where the financial sector, what the financial sector is doing, the answer seems to be much more than before. This is because there's now more credibility in the commitments of governments and greater disclosure than a short while ago. We would caution it might be premature to establish formal taxonomies at this stage, as they might quickly be out of date. Much remains to be done, but the conclusion we were offered on the private sector was that in terms of the private sector, the glass is now certainly half full. Finally, we heard about some aspects of the role of civil society, given that unless civil society is fully involved and committed, not much can be done. As we'd heard earlier, amongst these issues is the critical element is land use. Present food habits are not only cruel to animals, but they're deeply inefficient and they're unsustainable to the planet. And the broadening of perspective in this session, in all three of the speakers, is an indication of a wide range of issues and the diversity of people that have to be affected. You cannot outsource the activism, as it was said, in the climate change agenda. Basically, we all have a role and we all have work to do. So the conference leaves us with a good overview of the policy challenges that Europe will have to deal with in the coming decade and beyond to successfully meet its commitments to contain greenhouse gases and other destructive forces and to curb global warming. And one of the main messages from this conference is combating climate change requires not only the energies of some of our best scientists, but also our best social scientists, since one of the biggest channels will be to make the massive economic transformation associated with climate change feasible and palatable. And just in closing, as mentioned at the start, on an optimistic note, since yesterday, Europe has an important partner in the challenges of tackling climate change. We may also now have a competitor. The Paris Accord commitments were seen as a starting point, with countries offering more over time as they embrace the concepts and technologies for combating climate change. So instead of a race to the bottom, where each country delivers partially on its commitments and justifies this by saying it's a bit more than its neighbor, yesterday may be the start of a race to the top. We've heard that the European Green Plan will make Europe the first continent to be carbon neutral. Things may move quickly. Maybe to achieve the ambition to be first, Europe will indeed not only have to deliver what's in the plan, but will need to go even further and even faster. As noted at the start, the presentations have been recorded, not the Q&A sessions, and the resulting podcast will be posted on the UPEP webpage. UPEP aims to have another 2 or 3 seminars on climate change during this term or the next. So please, in closing, please look at the UPEP webpage from time to time. It can be accessed through the European Studies Centre at Antony's College. The details of future plans become available. And with all that, I wish you all a safe, healthy, and productive year. And thank you once again, and thank you all, and good evening. Bye.